Most of what we think we know about Hildegard of Bingen has been processed through one label, medieval mystic. That label covers maybe a third of what she actually did, and it's been quietly flattening the rest for centuries. Consider what the record shows. She lived from roughly 1098 to 1179, most of those decades in Benedictine monasteries in the Rhineland. During that span, she composed around 70 pieces of music, wrote a systematic natural history encyclopedia, produced a companion treatise on physiology and disease, and conducted preaching tours at cathedral churches across the Rhine Valley in her late 60s, and maintained active correspondence with 4 popes, the Holy Roman Emperor, and hundreds of abbots and bishops. The mystic label is not wrong. Her theological writings are substantial, and she described detailed visionary experiences across decades. But if you stop there, you've described the frame and missed the building. Let's start with why you probably haven't heard of her in full, or why, if you have, the image is narrow. Hildegard was not obscure in her own time. She was connected at the highest levels of 12th century institutional power. Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most influential churchmen in mid-12th century Europe, read her first major theological work, the Civias, and publicly endorsed her visions at a synod in the late 1140s. That endorsement mattered. It placed the institutional weight of the Church behind her work, and gave everything she wrote after a kind of official sanction that few medieval women ever obtained. But that validation cut 2 ways. Once she was the visionary abbess, that became the category through which everything she produced was understood. Her natural history got read as mystical cosmology. Her music was heard as devotional output rather than compositional achievement. The systematic intellectual ambition that runs across her entire body of work, the same drive to catalog, explain, and systematize, was repeatedly fragmented by later readers who only had access to one slice at a time and already knew what she was supposed to be. Add to that the general problem of medieval women's intellectual work, most of it didn't survive. What did survive usually did so because institutions found it useful, which meant it got packaged in ways those institutions understood. Hildegard's texts survived in quantity, which is remarkable. But they arrived at us downstream of several centuries of readers, sorting them into categories that were always smaller than the whole. The music is the best known part, and still underrated. Hildegard compiled her compositions into a collection she called the Symphonia Armonie Celestium Revelationum, the Symphony of the Harmony of Celestial Revelations. The collection survives in medieval manuscripts and is large by the standards of attributed medieval music. Around 70 texts set to music antiphons, hymns, and sequences, along with a complete liturgical drama. That drama, the Ordo Virtutum, is among the earliest morality plays for which music also survives, which places it in a very short list. The melodies stand out even to a non-specialist ear. They range wider than standard 12th century liturgical chant, extending across 2 octaves in some pieces, and they don't follow modal conventions as predictably as you'd expect from someone trained in the Benedictine tradition. Musicologists continue to debate what this means: genuine innovation, regional Germanic influence, deliberate rhetorical expansion enabled by her visionary authority, or some combination. What's not in dispute is her explicit claim to authorship of both texts and music, which places her in a very small group of medieval composers for whom we have that attribution at all. Most medieval music survives anonymously. Hers doesn't. Whether you read the compositional corpus as evidence of musical genius, or as evidence that her institutional position gave her freedoms that other composers didn't have, you're looking at an output that hasn't been fully absorbed into the standard history of medieval music. Less discussed is the natural philosophy. Hildegard wrote 2 substantial works on the natural world. The Physica is an encyclopedia organized by category: plants, trees, elements, stones, fish, birds, animals, metals, with medical applications attached to each entry. Causae et Curae is a companion text dealing with human physiology, illness, and treatment in more sustained form. Both draw on the medical tradition available in 12th century monastic Europe, which meant Galenic humoral theory and the Arabic medical works that had been filtering into Europe through translation centers in Spain and the Mediterranean. What Hildegard adds is her own cosmological framework, centered on a principle she called viriditas, usually translated as greenness or greening power, which she treats as a fundamental vital force in living things, a kind of animating surplus that health consists of and disease depletes. This blend of natural observation and theological cosmology looks unusual by modern standards. It was entirely normal for 12th century natural philosophy. What's worth noticing is the organizational ambition. This is systematic survey work, not anecdote or mystical meditation. The Physica runs to 9 books. Causae et Curae engages with reproduction, mental illness, and the physiology of the humors in a tone that reads as clinical rather than visionary. How much of the specific content reflects her own observation versus received tradition, Galenic, Benedictine herbal, Arabic, is something historians of medicine continue to debate. The framework across both texts is distinctly hers, and the ingredients are a mix. The correspondence is where the full picture becomes striking. Her epistolarium, the surviving collection of her letters, contains exchanges with figures across the top of the 12th century hierarchy. She wrote to Bernard of Clairvaux. She wrote to Eugenius III and at least 3 subsequent popes. She wrote to the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa on multiple occasions, and the tone of those letters is not straightforwardly deferential. She uses language that amounts to pointed counsel and, in some cases, rebuke, framed consistently as the transmission of divine vision rather than her own judgment. That framing is a rhetorical strategy worth sitting with. A woman writing to an emperor in her own name would have been ignored or worse. A woman transmitting divine revelation to an emperor occupied a different category. She had authority that was, by definition, above his. In the 1160s she extended this into physical space. She conducted several preaching tours through the Rhine Valley, speaking publicly at cathedral churches and monastic communities. Public preaching by women was not standard practice in 12th century Christendom. The record shows her doing it anyway, and there is no evidence she was censured for it. The exact scope of the tours is uncertain. Sources name several locations, but the full itinerary isn't recoverable. But the fact of them is not in doubt. By the time she died in 1179, she had spent several decades operating at a scale of political and ecclesiastical engagement that had no obvious template for a woman of her era. Why isn't she better known? The honest answer involves several problems compounding each other. The first is categorical. Hildegard doesn't fit cleanly into any box that a single modern academic discipline has for the 12th century. Musicologists have the Symphonia. Historians of medicine engage with the Physica and Causae et Curae. Theologians and church historians have the Civius and the correspondence. No discipline has custody of the whole, and none has built her into the standard narrative of its field as a central figure rather than a notable exception. She's a specialist reference across 4 or 5 fields rather than a household name in any one of them. The second problem is the exceptional woman framing, which took hold early and has been harder to dislodge than it should be. Treating Hildegard as singular, remarkable because she achieved all this despite being a woman, paradoxically obscures her rather than elevating her. It removes the historically interesting question, what kind of institution and moment produced her? And what does it say about what those institutions could have been that this particular outcome was possible? The formal history of her canonization is itself a data point here. The process of official canonization had been initiated multiple times over the centuries and was not completed until 2012, when Pope Benedict XVI canonized her and declared her a doctor of the Church. Why those earlier processes stalled is not fully clear in the historical record. The gap is suggestive even without a clean explanation. Here's where the evidence genuinely runs thin. The authorship question is real and unresolved. Hildegard worked for most of her adult writing life with a monk named Volmar, her confessor and secretary at her monastery, who transcribed her dictation, corrected her Latin, and worked with her on final phrasing. She was explicit about this collaboration. Her letters discuss the process directly. So when we read the Civius or the Physica, we are reading something that passed through at least one other hand before it became the text we have. How much Volmar shaped the intellectual content, how much he intervened only at the level of grammar and style, and where his influence ended and hers began is something scholars don't have a clean answer to. Medieval collaborative authorship was normal. The modern model of the author as solitary originator doesn't map cleanly onto 12th century textual production. But the attribution is more complicated than popular accounts usually acknowledge. We also don't know how to interpret the visions. Some medical historians have noted that the visual imagery Hildegard describes in the Civius, luminous geometric patterns, cascading lights, and visual disturbances across her field of perception, resembles phenomena reported during migraine aura. She had chronic illness across much of her life. But retrofitting a neurological explanation onto 12th century mystical experience is interpretive work the evidence can't fully support. It's a plausible hypothesis. It is not a settled answer. What we do know is that she was careful, across decades, to frame the visions in ways that made them theologically defensible. Whether that care was primarily strategic, primarily sincere, or something that doesn't map onto either category is the kind of question the record can't settle. What survives is often what was useful to power, not what was true. Hildegard's work survived in quantity, more than most contemporaries, more than almost any other medieval woman. What got lost was the interpretive frame that would have made her legible as one coherent thinker, rather than a specialist footnote in 4 different fields. The category we've assigned her has been smaller than she was. If that's new information, or if it confirms something you already suspected about which medieval minds get transmitted, and how, that's the point. I'm Marcus. Until next time.